Well, today marks a big day, a big win for Wall Street because the Federal Reserve has decided to water down banking regulations that were actually meant to prevent another disaster like the global financial crisis of 2008. All right, so the capital reserves that a bank contains is really at the center of this regulation. And the Federal Reserve, in response to some of these smaller banks failing recently, wanted to increase the amount of Federal Reserves that banks have in order to prevent, financial collapse. So again, a bunch of banks like Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic, they failed. Then the Fed wanted to overhaul something called it's the Basel Endgame. Okay, so under this new rule, the world's largest banks, aka those with $250 million or more in assets, would have to have their capital requirements boosted to 19% or by 19%. But they didn't want to do that. And they're honest about why they didn't want to do that. Capital requirement, again, is a term for how much money the banks are required to hold as a buffer against big losses. Because, when you deposit your money at a bank, it doesn't just like sit there. Usually the bank invests that money. Okay, they gamble with your money. But the Federal Reserve wants to ensure that these banks have enough capital as a buffer to prevent some of those, prevent a complete and utter disaster if some of those investments go south. So the Fed argued that the change was intended to keep large banks from doing too much risky lending and trading. But the banks made a curious claim to push back. They said this: by raising the capital the banks are required to hold as a cushion against losses, the plan could have also made loans more expensive or harder to obtain, pushing more activity to non-bank providers, according to trade organizations. Wait, hold on. So the big banks are worried that the capital requirement would make it harder for ordinary people to get loans at their big bank, and thus they would need to go to a smaller bank or a non-bank provider, non-bank institution. How is that a bad thing? Isn't that a good thing? I mean, don't you want options for people? Like, I think one of the issues with our banking system is we have those banks that are too big to fail. That was a line that was commonly heard after the 2008 economic collapse, because the idea was, well, if we just allow these banks to fail, these big banks, that would crush the economy because of all the people that are employed at these big banks, all of the stake that these big banks have in our overall economy. And so why would the Fed find that argument convincing?
Hey, don't scroll away. Come back. Because before the video continues, we just want to urge you to lend your support to TYT. You power our honest reporting. You do it at tyt.com/team, and we love you for it.
Now, unfortunately, it appears that they did find it convincing. We're gonna get to what the Fed ended up doing in just a moment. But the big banks also spent a lot of time lobbying. They lobbied pretty hard. Okay, so this May, the Wall Street Journal reported that JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon, at a meeting in Washington last fall, told his fellow CEOs to bypass Michael Barr, the central bank's vice chair for banking supervision and the main architect of the original plan to increase their capital requirements by 19%. So as I mentioned, big banks don't like it. So Jamie Dimon, urged his fellow bankers to instead press the Fed or press other Fed governors, in particular Chair Jerome Powell, to alter the proposed capital rules. So big US bank CEOs also met with Jerome Powell, more than a dozen times between last July and March, according to the central banker's public calendar. Barr met 15 times with the CEOs of the largest US banks during the same period. He also met with Dimon in April and in May, a Fed spokesperson said. So Barr in a statement said something that was, in my opinion, obvious and pretty clear, but for anyone who needs to hear it, quote, "I have not felt bereft of attention from the banking lobby." Oh, I'm sure you didn't, Barr. I'm sure you didn't. And so look, they were in high gear. They're like, we're gonna do what we can to prevent this, or at least water down this regulation, because they want to invest as much of their capital as possible, because that stands to benefit them with potentially more profits. Like, that's what they want to do. Having a capital buffer at a higher percentage means that they have less capital to play with, less capital to invest. And so they don't like that. They want to prevent that from happening. And in the end, it looks like the Federal Reserve went along with what they wanted. So the banks weren't just going after the Fed. They also conducted a PR campaign against the regulations. For instance, Goldman Sachs spent millions on its own advocacy campaign. The Financial Services Forum, which represents the 8 largest US banks, also asked its members to chip in $2 million apiece on another ad campaign. Do you guys understand? Like, they're not spending money because they're really concerned about the possibility of ordinary Americans being able to obtain loans, okay? They're spending a lot of money on this PR campaign because they want to protect their profits. It's an investment that they're doing on behalf of themselves. And in fairness, the opposition to the new rules didn't just come from the banks. It also came from, a certain caucus in Congress that is, look, this is, the Congressional Black Caucus is full of all sorts of politicians that take major donations from the banking industry and Wall Street. So I was unsurprised to find, according to the Wall Street Journal, that members of the Congressional Black Caucus, housing advocates, and civil rights groups said the new requirements could inadvertently widen a long-standing racial home ownership gap by making it more expensive for banks to offer mortgages to lower income and minority borrowers. But look, I was in the market for a home loan. And you want to know which banks had the absolute highest interest rates associated with the loan, with the mortgage? The big banks. I did not get my loan from a big bank. So, I don't know how that argument makes any sense. In fact, you could do this right now. Go ahead and look for, well, don't do it right now because you're watching the show, but after the show, search for high yield savings accounts. Take a look at what JP Morgan Chase or Chase Bank pays in interest for a high yield savings account. Then go to one of the smaller banks. Which bank is going to give you a higher interest rate on your savings? It's not going to be Chase. It's not going to be Wells Fargo. I know, because obviously I've researched this myself. And so it's just curious that this is the argument that you're hearing from some of our lawmakers, who I'm sure haven't taken a dime from the banking industry or Wall Street. And it's no surprise, anti-regulation Republicans also spoke out against the Fed, and eventually the campaign worked. Although they weren't able to completely scrap the increased capital requirement, they did water it down from 19% to 9%. And by the time the regulations are finalized, the 2024 election will already have taken place, which is not good news if Donald Trump gets elected, because I don't think Donald Trump would want the Fed to move forward with this regulation. I could be wrong, but I do think that Kamala Harris would be more likely to allow the Fed to be independent and implement this new increased capital requirement policy. But we'll see. We'll see what the final result will be, because we still don't even know if the big banks will have an increased capital requirement at all.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.